At the helicopter factory, universal metalworking machines are installed. Various parts are made from titanium, magnesium and aluminium alloys and steels of various kinds. This is the most heavily automated section at the entire factory. For this enormous rotor-driven machine, precision in the details is very important. A part can't differ in size from the standard by more than 1/100th of a millimeter. This difference can't be seen with the naked eye. These are modern machines that make it possible to reduce the labor involved in manufacturing parts by at least 2 to 3 times over. For some parts, we can even manage to reduce this by 4 times. We exclude the human factor. A person can get sick, fail to turn up for work, or make some error. The machine always does the same thing, with the same degree of precision. The cutter elements have 5 degrees of freedom. This makes it possible to cut the metal into parts of almost any configuration. There's only a limit on size, up to 2 meters. Dozens of tools are required for making the parts: rotary tools, bores, screw taps, chisels and drills. The machine operator doesn't have to change them manually. This is done automatically. Up to 80 different tools can be installed in the machine drum. They do their work with incredible precision. At the same time, in another workshop, longerons are being woven, the base of the rotor blades of the future helicopter. One of the latest technological innovations at Rosvertol involves not using metal in blades. The metal has been replaced by composite materials. This is a longeron from the main rotor of the Night Hunter. It's very durable, and for its large size, it's quite flexible and light. Longerons are made of fine thread, which is very strong. It's made of 4 fiberglass filaments together, which are 7,000th of a millimeter in width. With a length of almost 8 meters, the longeron weighs less than 100 kilograms. And it's also quite flexible. It's hard to imagine that it's made of fine filaments. First of all, 200 of them are glued together in a row, creating fiberglass ribbons. And then with a machine, these ribbons are placed together crosswise to create the form. Longeron, the machine has to make 144 runs and use almost 3,000 kilometers of fiberglass filaments that are glued together into strips. These strips make the longeron more durable and stop it from shattering if hit by a bullet or a shell. Heat treatment makes it possible to create a single whole part from the threads. They're rubbed with a bonding agent, and under pressure they're baked in an oven. Then the form is removed, and a durable and light longeron is left behind. Tail sections are attached to it, and the blade is complete. Each blade is tested for the correctness of its aerodynamic profile. A measuring machine takes 3.5 hours to pass over around 500 control points from both sides of the blade and the indications with a computer model. The blade of the helicopter rotor performs the same function as a wing on an airplane. It creates ascension power or lift. The forepart of the blade is called the longeron. The front section is protected by a titanium sheath under which the electrical anti-icing system is located. The longeron has tail sections attached to it, like feathers on a bird's wing. In each of them, there's a hexagonal cell core. The blades are of a rectangular form and have arrow-shaped tips. They reduce the level of noise made by the rotor. Unlike other helicopters, the Mi-28 has a rectangular form and arrow-like tips. They reduce the level of noise made by the rotor. This improves the camouflage of the helicopter. The blades of the Night Hunter are profiles used with an irregular curve, which creates greater ascension power and lift. The titanium sheath is needed for protection from sand and other hard particles. During takeoff and landing, the ends of the blades reach a speed of around 200 meters per second, At this speed, sand and dust that is blown off the ground by the flow of air acts like a grinding machine. Titanium protects the longeron from abrasion. First of all, reducing the weight of the main rotor makes the helicopter itself lighter, and secondly allows it to fly at higher altitudes. To reduce the weight of the helicopter, composite materials are now used in the blades, and in some cases even paper is used. It's steeped in varnish and glued together into hexagons like this. The hexagonal cells are then dried under pressure and covered with compositional plates, and the result is a light and durable material. The rotor turns, the centrifugal force makes the flexible blade into a hard wing, which allows the helicopter that weighs many tons not only to stay in the air, but also to perform complex aerobatic maneuvers. Composite materials can't yet fully replace metal, so aluminum and aluminum alloys still form the basis of aircraft construction. But metals have a quality that limits their longevity. Acid treatment procedures help to prolong their period of service life. Before the assembly starts, all the aluminium parts are protected from corrosion. This is done at the anodizing department. The parts are immersed in baths with various acids, and a durable oxide protective film forms on the surface of the metal. This film covers the clean metal and stops it from reacting with acid in the surrounding environment. This is corroding. Anodizing is a long process with many stages. First, the aluminium is grease removed from it in an alkaline solution. Then the oxide film is removed from the surface, which forms natural. Then it's bleached in nitric acid, and then it's anodized in sulfuric acid. The process takes place in the presence of an electric current. Depending on the qualities that the film should have, an according procedure is selected. The intensity of stress, the current, the temperature of the solution, the length of the procedure are adjusted. Between each stage, the parts are washed in baths, first with hot and then with cold water, to remove the previous solution. But the oxide film that forms in this way still has micropores. This may allow corrosion, and they have to be corked. In the language of professionals, this process is called compressing. Various solutions are used for this. They give the aluminium a new color, from green and gold to black or red. To assemble the fuselage of the helicopter, you need to connect a huge number of parts with rivets. This is done in the modular assembly workshop. First, holes are drilled in the parts, and then the rivets are driven in with pneumatic hammers. This is why it's always very noisy in this workshop. Around 10,000 rivets are used for one fuselage. It's very important that them are made perpendicular to the part. A rivet that's driven in on an angle will carry a very heavy load and may break. A supervisor checks the work of each riveter.
And we have confirmed with 3 separate sources that the Clinton bought and paid for fake news Russia propaganda dossier was in fact used in part to obtain FISA warrants to surveil members of the Trump campaign and Trump transition. Now, this means that Hillary Clinton and the DNC, remember that Donna Brazile said Hillary controlled the DNC? They paid millions of dollars for what is a totally phony document full of Russian lies and propaganda that was then used by the Obama administration to surveil members of an party and incoming president. This is the same dossier that former FBI Director James Comey testified under oath as being salacious and unverified. And that information is only the tip of the iceberg. Carter reporting, and we are also learning that more shocking information will be coming out in just days that will show systemic FISA abuse. This is the real Russia scandal, the real Russia collusion story. Now, the dossier was used to target an opposition party and criminalize political differences. That's the real story. That's what the media has not and will not cover, and Democrats do not want you to know anything about. But unfortunately, they will be forced to cover the story. All of this is unprecedented in the history of the country. This is a sober moment. You need to understand this. We are on the precipice of one of the largest abuses of power in U.S. American history. And I'm talking about the literal shredding of the U.S. Constitution, your Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. It is that serious. Now, this new information is confirming what we have now been saying and predicting for months on this show. Powerful tools of intelligence have now been politicized and used to influence a presidential election. Now, make no mistake about this scandal will reach the highest levels of the Obama intelligence community, the DOJ, the FBI, and what we're reporting on is only the beginning tonight. We'll talk to Sarah Carter about all the details in a minute, and also tonight, the president continuing to crush the destroy Trump liberal media and the left's completely false narrative about Russia collusion. It has now been over a year, and so far they have zero, zip, nada, nothing, no evidence of Trump, Russia collusion. Now, during a press conference today with Norway's prime minister, the president was asked about the Russia investigation and if he would do an interview with special counsel Robert Mueller. Here's his answer. Take a look.
There has been no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russians, or Trump and Russians. No collusion. When you talk about interviews, Hillary Clinton had an interview where she wasn't sworn in. She wasn't given the oath. They didn't take notes. They didn't record. And it was done on the 4th of July weekend. That's perhaps ridiculous, and a lot of people looked upon that as being a very serious breach, and it really was. But again, I'll speak to attorneys. I can only say this: there was absolutely no collusion. Everybody knows it. Every committee. I've been in office now for 11 months. For 11 months, they've had this phony cloud over this administration, over our government, and it has hurt our government. It does hurt our government. It's a Democrat hoax that was brought up as an excuse for losing an election that, frankly, the Democrats should have won because they have such a tremendous advantage in the Electoral College. So it was brought up for that reason. But it has been determined that there is no collusion, and by virtually everybody. I will say this: I am for massive oil and gas and everything else, and a lot of energy. Putin can't love that. I am for the strongest military the United States ever had. Putin can't love that. But Hillary was not for a strong military, and Hillary, my opponent, was for windmills.
Now, the president is right on several key points here. First of all, like he has been saying for months, like we have been saying, there is no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. This has been a conspiracy theory manufactured by the industrial fake news media complex that has been spread night after night, hour after hour, by the likes of CNN and Conspiracy TV, MSNBC. And as we have been showing you, the narrative is falling completely flat. So now the media is trying to attack the president, his mental health, which is completely ridiculous, so idiotic for so many reasons. For example, just yesterday, we could all see the president was in full control of that immigration debate at the White House, and that he had all of his faculties. But that doesn't stop your media from lying to you. Now, the other key point is the president is making now is that key Democrats, remember, they've all said that they have not seen any evidence of collusion. Don't take my word for it. Let's take their word for it.
Well, the allegation, of course, is that the Russians, in the hacking and dumping of documents in the election, had essentially relationships with Trump campaign people. But I'm not prepared to say that there's proof you could take to a jury.
Do you agree with this conclusion that the president has reached, that there was no evidence of collusion?
You know, we haven't seen any of that whatsoever, George. We've been looking and showing everything that they possibly have. That has not led to that.
The last time we spoke, Senator, I asked you if you had actually seen evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, and you said to me, and I'm quoting you now, you said, not at this time. Has anything changed since we spoke last?
Well, no, it hasn't.
I know we need to go soon, but just to be clear, there has been no actual evidence yet.
No, it has not been.
Okay.
No, not yet. Now, all of that is the reason why President Trump tweeted out today, quote, "The single greatest witch hunt in American history continues. There was no collusion. Everybody, including the Democrats, know there was no collusion, and yet on and on it goes. Russia and the world is laughing at the stupidity that they are witnessing. Republicans should finally take control." Make no mistake about it. This is a political witch hunt unlike anything this country has ever seen before.
December
and it continues
2008.
to be exposed. And as we have now
Israel
been
appeared
reporting
to
for
attack
months,
the
the
Gaza
special
Strip,
counsel, Robert Mueller,
seemingly
his
without
investigation
cause.
is nothing but a cesspool, an absolute
The
cesspool
world
of
reacted with
corruption.
demonstrations
Members of his
demanding
team,
Israel
they
to
don't
end the
donate to
violence
Republicans, but
and
over
free the
50 grand to
Palestinian
Democrats,
people,
including
with
giving
shouts
money
of
to Hillary
Zionism as
Clinton and Barack
racism and
Obama.
apartheid.
One lawyer
The
actually
world
represented
accused
Hillary
Israel of oppressing innocent civilians for
and
no
none of them
reason.
contributed to the Trump campaign. Key Mueller prosecutors also have
We evacuated the last inch of the Gaza Strip. We uprooted tens of settlements and evicted thousands of Israelis from their home. And in response, we received a hail of missiles on our cities, towns, and children. The claim that territorial withdrawals will bring peace with the Palestinians, or at least advance peace, has not stood the test of reality.
That stupid idea that we can exchange land for peace, I don't understand that. What does that mean? That means that for them, what's important is land, and for us it's peace. Means that after we exchange and they got the land, then they don't need anything more and we still need the peace. Who do we do it with if they have the land? So I mean, peace for peace I can understand. Land for peace, what is this?
If there was ever a question about whether land for peace was an issue, it was proved very clearly in 2005 when Israel withdrew completely from the Gaza Strip.
A few years ago, Israel decided to leave Gaza. They dragged their people out of Gaza and finally made Gaza Jew-free. So the Arabs would live without looking at one Jew. And what happened? Was Israel thanked for leaving the Gaza Strip? No.
What happened was Hamas came in, every infrastructure that was there, including greenhouses, including the agricultural industry that existed, was destroyed just because it had been Israeli. We saw a fundamental Islamist state rise in Gaza, and not only rise because they could form whatever state they wanted, but the whole aim of that state was to destroy Israel.
The response of the Arabs of the West Bank and Gaza was not to improve their lives and make a Hong Kong Gaza, start improving the lives of their children, education. No. What they did was roll their missiles, roll their Katyushas to the border of Israel and tell Israel, you're wrong for pulling out.
As soon as Israel left Gaza, the rockets started firing towards Sderot and towards Israel. So obviously they gave the land and they've never seen the peace.
The terror became so relentless. Thousands, I think 4,000 or 5,000 rockets have been fired from Gaza into the south of Israel, our population centers, since Israel our Jewish communities there and withdrew all our military forces there in response to the demand of the Palestinians and the international community to help encourage the establishment of some sort of independence for the Palestinians.
And that proves one thing. The seriousness of the claims of the Arabs that the problem is pulling out of the West Bank and Gaza.
In 1947, when the United Nations proposed the partition plan of a Jewish state and an Arab state, the entire Arab world rejected the resolution, whereas the Jewish community, by contrast, welcomed it by dancing and rejoicing. The Arabs rejected any Jewish state in any borders. Those who think that the continued enmity towards Israel is a product of our presence in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza is confusing cause and consequence.
After World War I, the victorious Allies began breaking up the defeated nations. The former Ottoman Empire was to be divided up, the region of Palestine for the Jews and Mesopotamia for the Arab nations. However, because of a growing towards a Jewish presence in the area, things began to change.
In 1922, Great Britain, unilaterally on its own accord, without international sanction, broke off 70% of what was the Palestine mandate given to them to promote close Jewish settlement, the creation of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. They broke off 70% of that territory, the eastern half on the other side of the Jordan River, to create a protectorate they called Transjordan.
Anti-Semitism around the globe was increasing, and the Middle East was no different. By the end of the Second World War, Transjordan would become the Kingdom of Jordan, an Arab state. Yet the world was still open to the idea of a Jewish homeland.
In 1947, the United Nations, when colonial empires all over the world in the wake of World War II were crumbling, recognized that the Jewish people had a deep, enduring, historic right to this land, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel.
However, because of intense opposition from the Arab nations, the UN sought to appease them by altering the partition plan further.
In 1947, that partition plan suggested, let's take that western part of Palestine and let's divide it. We're going to give a Jewish home, we're going to give a state a home to the Jews to be an independent state, and we're going to give another part of that Palestinian mandate to the Arabs who at this point live there. It doesn't matter whether they've been there for 1 generation, 2 generations or more. They hadn't been there for much more than that, the vast majority of them, but they deserve also some autonomy, independence, what have you. Let's divide it into 2 states. That's what was in vogue then.
We should emphasize that at the time, both the United States and the Soviet Union, the 2 great powers, voted for a partition where there'd be a compromise, where there'd be a land, they didn't use the word, Palestinians at the time were both Jews and land for Arabs, and there'd be a land for Jews, and there'd be an internationalized Jerusalem. When that partition was passed, there was joy in the Jewish part of Jerusalem, and there was not just mourning, but anger and threats and cries for revenge in the Arab parts of Jerusalem and throughout the Arab world.
Israel accepted the partition. We weren't happy about it, but we didn't want to have war, and we figured we would take the little bit that they were offering us. The Arab side never accepted it, and in fact went to war. 7 Arab states went to war against Israel. Israel exists today and is recognized today not because of the UN decision, but because the world recognized our Declaration of Independence.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל. היא מדינת ישראל.
After the declaration of the state on May 14, 1948, 5 Arab countries aggressively invaded what was designated as the Jewish areas of the state, and the newly formed State of Israel and the newly created IDF, Israel Defense Forces, were forced to defend themselves.
Britain had left the region and seemingly left the new Jewish state unprotected. Seizing the opportunity, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and help from the other Arab nations attacked, intending to remove every trace of a Jewish state. Yet the new nation fought back.
Over the period of the war, we were successful, and we managed to enlarge the area that was allocated under the UN plan and beat back the Arab aggressors.
After 1948, it's really interesting. I mean, we all know about the Palestinians, and we think that roughly, we don't have an exact count, but roughly 800,000 Palestinians were displaced. But at the same time, that they were virtually the same time as they were pushed out of or left their homes in what is now Israel, the Jewish population in Iraq, North Africa, Yemen, Aden, to some extent Egypt, Libya, which amounted to almost 1 million Jews. something that we forget, began to suffer increasing discrimination and violence, some of it related to the Israel-Palestine issue.
Arabs from Palestine were displaced due to the Arab-Israeli War. Yet Jews throughout the Middle East began facing intense persecution and ultimately became refugees themselves.
The bottom line was that a number of Jews, roughly equivalent to the number of Palestinian Arabs, ended up leaving their homes, leaving their countries, abandoning everything. There was nothing they could bring with them. They weren't allowed. And the large majority of them ended up in Israel.
Nearly 1 million Jews were forced to flee their homes in Arab countries. With nowhere else to turn, Israel seemed their only option. However, the new nation was not prepared to absorb so many in such a short time.
Certainly they had lost their possessions. They were no longer in their homes, but they were assisted either generously or less generously, but they were able to make new lives. Unfortunately, the refugees from Arab lands, the Palestinian refugees rather, did not get the same treatment, and they were not welcomed. Here we are in 2009, and they are still living in refugee camps, although they're not exactly camps in the same way that we might think of them. I mean, they're not tent camps for the most part. They're towns, but they're living in misery and essentially have little way out and have become very embittered over this, and yet, you know, that could have been solved. Was it the duty of Arab countries to solve it? I don't know. It depends how you feel about other human beings, I think.
Arab League policy is to keep the Arabs of the West Bank and Gaza in a permanent refugee status. This is the Arab League policy. If a Palestinian lives in Cairo or in Syria, in Damascus, they never get the Egyptian nationality or the Syrian nationality or whatever Arab country nationality. Why is that? This is dictated by the Arab League because they want to keep Palestinians refugees forever. So a Palestinian could be born and live and die in Egypt or Syria and never get the Egyptian nationality or the Syrian nationality.
I wouldn't say it was a cultural thing, and I just don't think so. I mean, I think it really was a political issue, and I think that, you know, they were a convenient tool, a whip with which to beat Israel, and they continue to be that.
This proves that the Arab world doesn't want to solve the refugee problem, because if the refugee problem is solved, there is no problem.
You'll always hear the international community, especially United Nations people, the Secretary General of the United Nations, whoever he is at the time, will always repeat a certain sentence, which is, Israel must withdraw to the lines of June 4th, 1967. And you've heard that a million times, I'm sure. And what's so important about June 4th, 1967? That's where they were the night before, on June 5th, the morning of June 5th, 1967, Israel struck first, started a 6-day war that changed all the borders around Israel. And because we struck first under the international, we're the aggressor, which means any territories we took are occupied territories.
The Six-Day War is a defining moment in the conflict. The Arab world was growing increasingly impatient with the Jewish presence. It was supposed to be Arab Islamic land. Hate-filled rhetoric filled the airwaves of the Middle East.
knew damn well I was a snake before you took me in. Does that make sense to anybody? Make any sense?
When the economy and the real estate market plummeted in 1990, attorney Alan Pomerantz says Trump owed $4 billion to his debtors, including that $1 billion for which he was personally responsible.
Because he personally guaranteed so much debt, the leverage shifted dramatically over to the banks, because it was no longer an issue of a bank and a piece of real estate. It was a bank and Donald Trump's actual survival.
Trump owed money all over town, to 72 banks in all. Pomerantz represented them as a group.
How close was he to going personally bankrupt?
Very.
Trump makes a point of saying he never went personally bankrupt, but there's a reason why the banks decided to keep Trump whole.
We made the decision that he would be worth more alive to us than dead.
In the 90s, Donald Trump was bailed out by Rothschild Inc. Wilbur Ross, Senior Managing Director of Rothschild, is now Commerce Secretary of the United States. The Rothschilds, one of the wealthiest families in the world, founded Israel. The Balfour Declaration in 1917, Britain signed over Palestine to Walter Rothschild to create a Jewish state.
This is the desk where the Balfour Declaration was composed and written. Funny you should say that. It is.
And here it is, the Balfour Declaration. What do you feel when you see it here?
I genuinely feel it's one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the Jewish people. If you think it took 3,000 years to get to this.
We love Israel. We will fight for Israel 100%, 1,000%. It will be there forever. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We kept him alive to help us.
Not only is Trump being financed today by Jewish billionaires, but he was also bailed out by the Rothschilds who founded Israel. He's not playing them. He has been close to them for a very long time. We know today that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction. Who lied about Iraq having WMDs and convinced Congress to support preemptively bombing Iraq?
And every indication we have is that he is pursuing with abandon, pursuing with every ounce of effort the establishment of weapons of mass destruction, including weapons. There is no question whatsoever that Saddam is seeking and is working and is advancing towards the development of nuclear weapons. No whatsoever. I have to say that in the history of democracies, preemption has been, in my mind, the most difficult choice for leaders to make. Because at the time of the decision, you could never prove the critics wrong. You could never show them the great catastrophe that was avoided by preemptive action. And yet we now know that had the democracies taken preemptive action to bring down Hitler in the 1930s, the worst horrors in history could have been avoided.
I think your statement, which is very eloquent, boils down to one thing, and that is, do we react to another attack on America after hundreds of thousands or millions of lives have been lost, or do we preempt that kind of action from happening in the first place? And I think you made a very strong case today that we should support President Bush and respond before it happens.
The main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq. The terrorists attacked us and killed 3,000 of our citizens before we started the freedom agenda in the Middle East. They were... What did Iraq have to do with what?
The attack on the World Trade Center.
Nothing.
Israel lied about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction, was harboring terrorists. Where did these lies originate?
Of Saddam's attempts to conceal and deceive the world, to conceal the effort at producing weapons of mass destruction. We in Israel have known this for a long time.
In 1981, Netanyahu wrote a book called International Terrorism, advocating for the West